Imagine you're sitting on the side of a ridge, trying not to slide down the slope in the slippery mud. Your rifle is set up on a tripod in front of you with the butt pulled snugly into your shoulder. One elbow is braced on your knee, the other is tucked against a shooting bag nestled against your binocular harness on your chest. The opposite ridge is covered with elk, to include a nice bull you have been watching for the past hour. That bull is standing on the edge of some thick timber, facing you almost straight on, about 330 yards away. You peer through your scope and verify your position is nearly rock steady, but you don't have a shot because a tangle of limbs are covering the elk's vitals. You and the elk stare at each other for what seems like an eternity. The clock is ticking, though. The sun has set, and light is fading. As you watch through the scope, the elk lets out a bugle, pauses for a few seconds, then begins to chuckle as he slowly turns to his right and exposes the left side of his chest. Finally, for the first time all afternoon, you have a clear window through the trees and limbs at his vitals. No sooner has he stopped moving than you have adjusted your crosshairs to place them centered on his heart and lungs, and then you squeeze the trigger. Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 396 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I just made it home from an outstanding elk hunt in Wyoming. That hunt was a lot of fun, and today's episode is a detailed recap of that whole experience and some evaluations of the gear I used. I also have two special announcements to share with you at the end of this episode. One of those announcements involves another Big Game Hunting Podcast group hunt that will take place in the USA during the fall of 2026. Stick around to the end of this episode to learn all the details. All right, let's dive right into things, and we'll get started talking about this elk hunt from the very beginning. Now, you may recall, if you've been listening to this podcast for long enough, that I shot my first elk all the way back in 2020. You can learn the full story of that hunt by listening to episode 114. My goodness, that was a long time ago. Now, I shot a small 4x4 elk on a self-guided hunt on public land in New Mexico. That was a fun hunt. I was very happy with how things turned out, but I have also mentioned in the past that I wanted to shoot a bigger elk. Well, that's where things go in this story today. Instead of going self-guided on public land, I went guided on private land, and this turned out to be a heck of an experience. Now, I used a Bergara SEMA CF rifle in 7mm PRC on this hunt. Now, I took that rifle to Africa. You may remember me discussing it in the episodes involving that hunt in July of 2025. Now, I received that SEMA, just 1 to 2 weeks prior to departing for Africa, so I haven't talked about it too much. I basically just got it with enough time to put a scope on it, sighted in with the ammo I was taking, verified that it shot well, and it did, and then I went hunting with it. Now, I have done a very basic introductory video on YouTube about the SEMA. You can check that out. There's a link in the episode description to learn more about it. But long story short, the SEMA is a lightweight and easy to carry rifle. Carbon fiber barrel, carbon fiber stock, all of that stuff. It weighs about 8 to 9 pounds fully loaded with a suppressor. Now, I'm not going to say it's the most accurate rifle I've ever shot, but I will say that it does shoot well with several different loads, and I was pretty happy with that, especially considering how darn light this rifle is. Now, my quest to hunt with a variety of 7mm PRC factory ammo continues. Now, the problem I'm running into now is that I've used a lot of the really popular stuff that people would normally associate with the 7PRC already, right? I've used the Hornady Outfitter and Precision Hunter. I've used the Federal Terminal Ascent. I've used the Nosler ammo, all of that stuff. I've also used the Federal Tipped Fusion ammo too. So with that in mind, I was on the hunt for less well-known 7PRC factory loads that were also available. Well, I found some Remington Premier long-range ammo loaded with a 175 grain Spear impact bullet. So I bought a couple boxes of that stuff off Midway, and I decided to see how it would perform in this rifle. And I was pleasantly surprised with how well it shot. Accuracy was right at 1 MOA out of the SEMA with a 5-shot group. It also performed well in gel, made a gigantic wound cavity, massive final expanded diameter of that bullet, along with good weight retention. And penetration wasn't amazing, but it was good enough in gel, and as I'll talk about later, it also performed well on this elk I ended up shooting. The only problem with this ammo was that it was very slow. Advertised velocity 3,000 feet per second with that bullet. I measured 2750 feet per second out of my rifle, 22-inch long barrel. Now, Hornady receives a lot of criticism from shooters that are upset that they are still listing 3,000 feet per second on their 175 grain factory loads for the 7PRC, despite all of that ammo going almost universally quite a bit slower than that. That is true. Like I said, that is well-deserved criticism they receive, but this problem is not limited just to Hornady, and the Remington ammo also had that same problem. But in any case, like I said, it shot well in my rifle. I wanted to hunt with it. I wanted to try it out, and even though it was going slower than advertised, it still wasn't a deal breaker. That worked out to about a 550-yard, with a little bit of extra buffer, effective range for me, that it was staying above 2,000 feet per second. That's about as far as I wanted to shoot an elk anyway, so that's what I went with. Now, I mentioned back in episode 327 that I attended the Bergara Shooting Academy in Wyoming. I went in 2024. I returned again in 2025. Had a great experience both times. And I know some podcast listeners have also been to the school and also really enjoyed it. But in any case, there's a hunting outfitter up there that runs this shooting school in the summertime, and then they hunt deer, elk, and antelope there in the wintertime. I got to talking to those guys and everything and was interested in the operation that they had there. So I ended up booking an elk hunt for October 2025 when I was there in 2024. So that's what this elk hunt was. I was hunting down in southwest Wyoming in that same area, staying in the same lodge I stayed at during the shooting academy, all of that stuff. So I flew up on October 20th. That was day one. I arrived in Salt Lake City at the airport there. They picked me up, about a 2-hour drive from Salt Lake to where we were hunting. Went to the lodge, got all my stuff set up, then went to the range to check zero. And I met my guide, Brian, at the lodge, and he drove me out to where we were going to shoot. Brian's a super nice guy. He has hunted with this outfitter for 15 years, and he clearly knew what he was doing. That was obvious from the first time I met him, and it became even more apparent as we hunted together. Now, a guy named Forrest Wilson was there to video this hunt as well. I knew Forrest from his days with Bergara. He still works with them sometimes, but he has set out on his own now. And like I said, he videoed my hunt, and he and I were together with Brian for this entire time. We all met up, went out to the range to verify zero and to stretch things out a little bit with my rifle before we started hunting. Got set up on the bench, fired 2 shots at a target at 100 yards, and those 2 bullet holes were touching each other at 100 yards. I actually thought I missed the target completely with that second shot until I realized that first bullet hole was just a little bit bigger. I observed no point of impact shift with my rifle. It was hitting exactly where it needed to be at 100 yards. So satisfied with that, I decided to shoot at some targets at a little bit longer range. They had a target at 320 yards and then some even farther out. So I plugged in all the atmospheric details into my Hornady 4DOF app, got the come up to go at the target at 320 yards, aimed dead center, boom, hit dead center. Perfect. Next target was at 500 yards. Adjusted my elevation for 500 yards, boom, hit that target. Then there was a steel deer-shaped target at 547 yards. Adjusted my scope again, fired twice more, boom, boom, 2 killing shots on that deer out there. That was as far as I felt comfortable shooting on this hunt. I was satisfied that the gun was hitting where I wanted it to. I had my dope set up appropriately for that altitude. Great day of shooting. That was it. I was ready to hunt. So we all had dinner in the lodge together that night. All of the guides, all of the other hunters that were there with me, went to bed, got a good night's sleep, woke up early the next day. Now, unfortunately, my right eye was starting to bother me that morning. It was draining a lot, and my eyelids were actually stuck together, and I had to go in the bathroom and wash all of the gunk out of my eye and all of that stuff. It hurt a little bit, but more than anything else, it just looked terrible. I looked in the mirror, and it was all bloodshot, just looked horrific. So clearly, I had picked up a case of conjunctivitis during my travels the previous day. But this is one of those things that there wasn't much I could do about it. Just had to suck it up and deal with it. I could still see okay, though, but I only mention this because this is going to play a part in the story later on in the hunt. So anyway, got all cleaned up, got dressed, went and had breakfast, then we headed out to hunt. That was a cold ATV ride up to the upper reaches of the property that morning. The lodge was at about 8,000 feet above sea level, and we went up to some even higher elevation parts of that area to hunt that morning. Now, even though it was pretty chilly, it was unseasonably warm while I was there. It's funny that it worked out this way because as the crow flies, I wasn't that far away from where I was hunting in Colorado almost exactly 1 year previously for my 2024 Cal moose hunt. Check out episode 337 to hear the story of that hunt. Well, that hunt was also unseasonably warm. It wasn't like hot when we were there, but it wasn't as cold as you would normally expect. But in any case, I was at higher elevation on this hunt, and it was getting down into, say, the 20 degrees Fahrenheit temperature level, getting up into the 60s. So go out in the morning, everything would be cold and frozen. It would gradually thaw out over the course of the day. Now, like I mentioned previously, I was hunting in southwest Wyoming, and we were hunting primarily on giant tracts of private land. Some of it was owned by the people that ran the outfitter. Some of it was leased. There was also some BLM and Forest Service and Wyoming state land and all that stuff kind of mixed in there, but primarily private land. Now, we were hunting very close to the Utah border. And once we actually got out to where we were hunting, we could actually see into Utah from various points down there. So had about a 20, 30-minute ATV drive up to where we were going to hunt that morning. Pretty darn cold. Got out. And there was still some snow on the ground from a previous hunt. Everything was frozen. It was very noisy walking around that morning, almost like we were walking on potato chips, just crunch, 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 crunch with every step. Very little wind that morning, very still, very quiet. Noise carried a long way. So we walked a short distance that morning, stopped, took a break, walked a little more, stopped, took a break. Every time we'd just kind of watch and listen, every time we'd stopped. After we'd gone a ways, Brian pulled out his bugle tube, bugled, listened, nothing happened, walked a little bit farther, he bugled again, and then an elk answered us. Now, the plan was to head up towards this meadow where you would traditionally see elk in the morning, and we heard that bugle from the direction of the meadow. So our path was going to kind of take us up and wrap around the edge of this meadow, and then we'd be able to peek into it from some trees. And as we were wrapping up and around to the right, we heard and saw some movement off to our left and saw that we had unexpectedly bumped a small group of elk. And they took off before we could even see them, and we saw them kind of go up over this ridge opposite us, go through some timber, and then eventually disappear. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but it looked like it was one decent bull with 2 to 3 cows with him. So we're less than an hour into the hunt this morning. We've already seen a shooter bull. Didn't have a shot on him, but not a bad start. Kept walking up towards that meadow, and we bumped 2 more smaller bulls. And once again, we saw them. They took off running. And it seemed like these elk had just heard us walking, got cued into us, and then they took off moving. And like I said, didn't have a shot on any of them. We made it to that meadow, sat there for a little bit, called, glass, all that stuff. Didn't see anything. So we headed back to camp and walked back to where the ATV was, got in the ATV, and took a different route back to camp than we had gone out that morning. On this way back, we went along the edge of a really big valley, looked on the opposite ridge, saw a very nice bull about 700 yards away. But he was a long way off, much farther than I felt comfortable shooting, and he was in some thick aspens and was moving and disappeared within 1 or 2 minutes after we saw him. And there was a smaller bull with him. So that was kind of a slow morning, but even so, we saw, I think, about 8 elk, to include probably about 2 shooter bulls. So not a bad morning at all. Now, the problem I was having was my eye was getting worse as the day progressed. Had lunch, kind of took it easy early in the afternoon. Then we went back out that afternoon And we went to a different spot. We went to a meadow where Brian had had some success in the past. He said almost every time he'd go there, he'd see elk either moving through there or just kind of hanging out there. That area had food, it had water. It was also a travel route between where those elk like to bed and eat and all of that stuff in that area. So got set up on the edge of this meadow, and we were going to sit there for several hours. Late in the afternoon, Forrest got my attention, pointed to a shape that was moving over a ridge, kind of right at the far edge of our view to the right. Big black shape. I thought, oh man, maybe this is an elk coming in. Looked at it through my binoculars and saw it was a moose. Looked like a pretty darn nice Sierras moose though. Walked over this ridge, came across our front from right to left, stopped basically right in front of us, about 250, 300 yards away, and was munching on some willows that were out there in this meadow. So that was pretty cool. I'd rather see elk, but not a bad day seeing moose. And then after a while, we saw another moose that appeared where that one had just come from, followed in almost the same trail that he went to get to that meadow. Also kind of hung out there. They both ate, hung out there for a little while, and then right towards dark, they actually started sparring a little bit. We could hear their horns click it against each other as they kind of lightly fought out there in this field. A little around this time, we saw a tan shape move through the woods to the left of this meadow up high, kind of come down low, and then disappear into the really thick stuff along the edge of the meadow. And every now and then, those moose would kind of look and stare off into the woods in that direction where we saw that movement. And that was a bull elk. I'm certain it was a bull elk that I saw move down like that, but it never came into the meadow. And I'm guessing that those moose saw and or heard it or maybe smelled it too and kept looking at it. But that elk never came into the meadow while we were there. And Brian told us later that elk don't like moose, and the fact that those moose were hanging out in the meadow meant that that elk probably wasn't going to come out. After it got dark, we packed up, walked back to the ATV, and we were almost back to the ATV, getting ready to head back to camp when we heard that elk bugle from what sounded like right in the middle of that meadow. So not a great afternoon, but still cool to see those moose out there doing that stuff. And it was still only the first day of the hunt. Went back to camp, had dinner. My right eye is feeling terrible at this point. Now my left eye is starting to bother me. Go to bed that night, and I wake up. Both of my eyes are draining now, and they're both glued shut. I could barely see as I kind of stumble into the bathroom to kind of wash all the gunk out of my eyes, all of that stuff. My right eye was less bad than it was the previous day, but my left eye was worse. And it was actually much worse than the right eye ever got. Like I said, just terrible case of conjunctivitis that I came down with. Once I washed my eyes out, I had some eye drops and stuff, to kind of rinse them out. Got all the stuff out of them. I was eventually able to see. It started off real blurry in the morning, but the more I blinked and after I woke up a little bit, I was able to see fine. It just looked horrific. Both of my eyes were really bloodshot, and my left eye in particular, the eyelids in the area around it was really swollen. I'll tell you, I got a lot of strange looks from guides and other hunters that morning as I was sitting there eating breakfast. I was sitting there by myself because I wasn't feeling great, not talking to anybody, eating breakfast, drinking my coffee, and I'd look up as a guy would walk past me, and he would just kind of give me a glance and then give me a double take as he looked at my eyes. But oh well, what are you going to do, right? It's probably a viral infection that I had. I wasn't in a position to get antibiotics, and even if I could have gotten antibiotics, it probably wouldn't have helped anyway because it turned out to be a viral infection. So I just had to suck it up and deal with it. And like I said, at this point, I could see fine. So had breakfast, headed out that morning. It was cold, but not quite as cold as it was the previous day, but everything was still frozen. And in light of the fact that everything was frozen, Brian came up with the idea that we were going to go to a different place where we actually had seen those elk late in the morning the previous day, park up there, walk a short distance, look down into this big valley in front of us, see if we could see elk moving in there, make a plan, and then if things didn't work out there, head to where we had hunted first thing in the morning the previous day, a little bit later in the morning where the ground had thawed out and we could walk around without making so much noise. So we headed out to that valley first thing in the morning, got there just as it was getting light enough to see, walk off to the edge of this ridge, and there's elk everywhere down in there. We saw right off the bat a group of about 20 to 30 elk moving away from us in the dim early morning light. They were a long way off, though. They were down in the very bottom, kind of heading up into the trees where we'd seen that elk the previous day. They started out at like 500 yards and quickly opened the distance and then disappeared into the trees. Looked like a couple nice bulls with a bunch of cows and calves and younger bulls and stuff in there. Saw a couple of other elk around in that area, just glassing up there early in the morning. Nothing that was either looked appealing enough to pursue or was in a position where we could pursue it. So we continued to drive, made it to another spot where I was like, hey, what is that out there in front of us? We stopped, looked, it's a group of 7 bull elk standing in a field eating. Thought, perfect, man. All those elk had their heads down, didn't see us. The wind was good, so they couldn't smell us. And they were only about 350 yards away. But, got to looking at the phone and stuff on Onyx Maps. Brian confirmed, hey, they're actually on a neighboring piece of property. The outfitter had hunting rights on almost all this private land in this area, except for like this one tract, and those elk all happened to be on it. But they were only 20 yards away from the fence. Now, we could drive through that land to go somewhere else, but we couldn't shoot anything that was on it. But since they were so close to the fence, Brian was like, all right, listen, I'm going to try and call at these elk and see if we can entice them to move towards us. There's one nice bull with him. If he jumps that fence, you can shoot him. Okay, no problem. Get out there, start calling at the elk, but they just weren't having it. They weren't inclined to get closer to us, and they eventually kind of took off running and left. We kind of followed them through the trees with our binoculars and whatnot, and they actually picked up a couple of other elk that we hadn't seen previously as they moved away from us. But already at this point, I mean, it's not even 8 o'clock in the morning, and we've already seen more elk than we had seen the previous day. So eventually those elk are gone, and things are starting to warm up a little bit. The ground isn't quite so frozen, so we drive the ATV over to where we hunted the previous day, got out, started walking, and we're able to move quietly through this area now. It's nice soft ground, all that stuff. We slip quietly up to that first meadow that we had hunted previously. Brian, would bugle and cow call occasionally, didn't get any responses. Get up to where we were glassing that first day on the meadow, and I'm looking around in this meadow, don't see anything. Brian is standing just to my right, so he has a slightly different angle, and he's like, hey, John, come over here. There's 3 elk down here. And I'm like, where? What elk are you looking at? And he pulls me over to where he was, and there was actually a tree that was blocking my view of these elk all the way at the bottom, only about 200 yards away from us. Get set up on the sticks. I'm getting set up, getting ready to shoot. These elk see us. They start moving away. Brian's looking at them through his binoculars as they're moving off while he's cow calling to them. Gets one of them to stop. Turns perfectly broadside, 250 yards away from us. Nice chip shot. And he's like, hey, don't shoot. That's not a big enough bull. And I said, okay. And it was 2 bulls and a cow, both about 4-pointers. The 2 bulls take off, disappear on the other side of the meadow. The cow actually moved towards us. And Brian was able to call her into about 100 yards or so. She was curious. The wind was good. She could see something was going on there, and was curious about these calls. And Brian always carried a cow decoy, a 2-dimensional cow decoy that he had folded up, tucked underneath his bino harness. He had it folded up sort of like some people do with like a sunscreen that they put in the front of their cars. So he had it folded up in a nice compact shape, and every time we'd see an elk, he'd whip out that cow decoy and start cow calling. The idea being, well, if this elk doesn't smell us, doesn't know quite what we are, and they just see something moving there, okay, they see this cow, they hear cow calls, maybe they'll hang around for a minute and maybe give us a shot if they think it might be a cow that they're looking at. So that's what he was doing with this cow. She hung around for a long time. I could have easily shot that cow if I would have been so inclined. And she eventually just kind of moved off into the woods, and that was that for her. So things are also going well this morning. I've seen shooter bulls now that I could have shot, and like I could have very easily shot that smaller bull. But it was still, morning of the first day, not at all a sort of elk I was going to shoot under those circumstances. So Brian, Forrest, and I continue to walk, and we make a little bit different circle through this area, or different circuit through this area than we had the previous day. And there was a pond that he said that the elk were always moving through that area. Sometimes they would stop to drink at it. Sometimes they would just kind of transit through that area. But there was a pond up a little bit higher in that general area. And that was the direction that those elk we had initially spooked the very first morning. They'd all gone up that way. He was like, let's walk up there, see what sort of activity is going on up there. Maybe we'll see some tracks. Maybe we'll see some elk up there by that pond, and we can make a plan and decide what to do. Well, we started gaining elevation to get up towards that pond, but as we did that, the temperature was dropping, and the ground was starting. The higher we got, the more and more frozen the ground got. So we stopped, and he's like, we're just going to scare everything off with as much noise as we're making. Let's make a different circuit, go back to the ATV, and we'll kind of hunt our way down. So we start walking back down, get back down into softer ground where we're not making so much noise. And we approach a different meadow that we had walked through earlier, and we spook a bull at like 70 yards. And like he had been doing, Brian whips out that cow decoy, starts cow calling, all that stuff. And this elk runs a short distance and stops. Now, at this point, we are in a tree line with a bunch of aspen trees. And so we're just kind of getting glimpses of this elk as it's moving through the meadow. And that's a sword that kind of cuts both ways. It was hard for us to see him, but it was also hard for him to see us. And the wind was good, so he couldn't smell us. And he was hearing these cow calls and seeing this cow decoy. And so he settled down and was just kind of walking around out there, just kind of looking at us and stuff, and hung around long enough where I had to move several times, getting on the sticks, trying to get a shot at him and whatnot. But I eventually got in a spot where I could see him clearly, and Forrest could see him clearly with the camera, and Brian could look at him clearly enough with his binoculars and say, okay, this is a nice bull. This is one that's big enough that we can shoot. And he was about, I think, 300 to 320 yards from us at this point on the far side of this meadow. He had gradually kind of moved away from us slowly with all of this going on, because this took about 1 to 2 minutes of moving around, trying to get situated where all of that stuff could come together. So I'm set up on my tripod. By the way, I'm using Spartan Ascent tripod that had the legs lengthened that I could shoot off of it standing up. And I'm set up there, ready to go. Forrest is next to me filming. This elk is moving right to left, and he stops behind a bunch of bushes and is feeding and stuff there. And I've got my rifle dialed, safety's off, round in the chamber. As soon as this elk steps out, I'm going to be in a position where I can shoot him. And he starts moving from right to left. Then we see his antlers appear out of the bushes, then his head and his neck. And then he stops and then turns directly away from us. It just walks straight away and disappears into the woods. If you'd have taken just a couple more steps, I could have shot him, but he didn't. And he did the thing that animals just do sometimes. They have, I don't know, maybe that sixth sense or whatever that tells them something isn't right. And, I need to change what I'm doing. And so he moved into the woods, and that was that for him. But every encounter we were having with elk was getting us closer and closer and closer. That elk was seconds away from being shot that morning. So we were all feeling pretty good. And, once we were satisfied he was gone, we packed up, started continuing to walk across that meadow, getting to where we had the ATV parked. And we'd gone another couple hundred yards, and we see something move in the aspens ahead of us, get set up on the sticks, all that stuff. And I could see something moving out there, and it kind of peeks its head around, and, oh, it's a calf. It's a calf elk. So, another elk that we had encountered. Once again, not a shooter or any of that stuff, but that could have been a dead elk if it would have been the right one. So pack up, get in the ATV, go back to camp. All in all, pretty good morning. Much busier than the previous day, which, even though it was kind of slow, still wasn't bad. Now, fortunately, my eyes are starting to improve. My right eye is doing a lot better, and my left eye had improved from horrific to just terrible.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
So we go back to camp, have a nice lunch. Brian talks to some of the other guides that were in camp. There were a total of 15 hunters in camp with me, and other hunters have been steadily killing elk this entire time. And I think, gosh, by this point, they've already killed 6 or 7 elk or something like that. So there's a lot of other guides that their hunter has killed, and they are available to help. And that was a cool thing that I liked about how things worked at this outfitter. Your guide work real hard for you, get you on a good bull that you were happy with. When you had killed it and done, that guide would turn and would help out one of his buddies and help them be successful and all of that. They'd do various different things and, either scout for each other or just straight up go out with each other and whatnot, help pack out animals, help spot animals, that sort of thing. So he was talking to some of these other guides that had been successful actually that morning. So we went out to a completely different area that afternoon where 2 other guides had been that morning with one of their clients. That guy had killed a bull first thing in the morning. That other hunter had a family emergency come up during his hunt, and he needed to head home. They got on a big herd of elk that morning. He ended up shooting a spike, killing it. He was happy with that. He just wanted to get something down so he could wrap up his hunt and go home. So he shot that spike out of a big group of elk, like 30 plus elk. Bunch of cows and calves in it. There were some other spikes in that herd. There was also a decent bull and a nice bull remaining in that herd. And so that's what these other guys told Brian. So I learned later that the way things worked in that area where those elk were was they liked to bed during the day up high in some thick timber. Then in the evening, they would come down, cross a creek, cross another ridge, cross another creek, go feed in this other area. Then first thing in the morning, they would head back towards where they were bedding. Well, that other hunter had ambushed that group of elk on their way back in the morning. So we decided we were going to head out to that same spot in the afternoon and try and catch them late in the evening as they were heading down for their nightly routine. So we take the ATV out that afternoon, and we get there just in time to see the last few cows and spikes disappear into the timber. And we walked down into that canyon, found a good vantage spot where we could see this entire canyon and be perfectly set up if they reappeared where they went into the timber, but also be set up in a spot where we could see the elk if they came across the canyon in a different spot, and then we could make a move on them if that happened. Now, 2 other guides accompanied us on this portion of the hunt. Finney and Carson. Now, Brian knew that area well. He had hunted there a lot, but Finney and Carson were there literally that morning. And so they were there to kind of give us more up-to-date intel, also just extra pair of eyes and a strong back and all of that stuff. So we get out there, get set up on the edge of this canyon, and I'm on a relatively steep downward slope. And also it was late in the afternoon, and so it was the warmest part of the day. All that ground had thawed out, and it was really muddy. It was very slippery walking down to where we were, and it was kind of muddy where we were sitting there. So, I had my tripod set up, legs shortened so I could shoot sitting off of it now, and I'm backed up into a bush for support and all of that stuff, and to give me some cover behind me so I'm not just kind of standing there silhouetted. But I made a pretty good shooting position. I'd have to move every now and then, kind of scoot my butt back up the hill a little bit, but all in all, it wasn't bad. Now, the opposite hillside was pretty open, just a bunch of grass and stuff down low. Go up a little bit higher, you'd run into some aspen trees. As you got higher on that ridge, the aspen trees would get thicker, and then it got into some very thick pines and other evergreens up real high. After we'd been sitting out there for a while, we heard some bugles coming from the opposite hillside. And Brian was telling me, he's like, okay, that bull is probably bugling from his bed, because every time we'd hear those bugles, they'd be from the same spot. Here in a little bit, we're going to start to see cows come out and spikes come out and the small bulls come out and start feeding. Then he's eventually going to stand up, and that big bull is going to come out towards the end of the group. And that's actually what ended up happening. From the sound of his bugles, we could tell we had the indication that we were set up in the right spot, very close to parallel from where that bull was bedded. And then after a while, cows started coming out. They'd come off the top of that ridge and then slowly move down through the aspen trees and feed, kind of down and moving from our right to our left. And all of those cows stayed up in the aspens. Nothing got out into the open part of that slope while we were there. But we could see them clearly. They'd move behind an aspen and then move into another opening and all of that stuff. We continued hearing those bugles from up high, and then eventually we saw a much different, much bigger elk shape kind of appear over the top, and then he bugled on our side. It's like, okay, yep, that's him. Now, he came down out of the thick timber, and he moved down into the left like the cows and the smaller bulls did, but he stayed higher on the slope than the other elk did. And so he was in the thicker aspen trees. Now, that was a problem because, like I said, the trees were thicker up there, and it was hard to find a shooting window. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I was sitting on that opposite ridge, leaned back on my backpack, had that rifle mounted on my Spartan Ascent tripod up in front of me. So it was very stable, set up. I got it all set up right when we arrived. And then as soon as I sat down, I ranged a bunch of likely spots that I might shoot an elk at on the opposite ridge. And a lot of that was in between 300 and 375 yards away. No problem. So I had an idea in my mind where I would likely get a shot on this elk. And I had memorized, okay, if he pops out here, I dial, this many MOA up, that sort of thing. So he's moving down into the left, and I get on him with the rifle, and I'm tracking him as he moves, and every time he'd stop, I'd stop. But every time he would stop, there would be something blocking his vitals, and I could just see glimpses of his body moving through the woods. And there were a couple times where he got real close. I got real close to shooting him. If he would have, maybe taken one more or one less step, he would have been in a spot where I had a clear shot on his vitals, but there'd either be a tree or a bunch of branches or something like that covering his vitals. And, Forrest was right there, maybe 2 or 3 yards away from me, videoing the whole thing. But his angle was just enough different where there was a couple of spots where it looks like in the video, he's standing there with a clear shot, but just changed the angle just a tiny bit to where I was, and there's stuff blocking his vitals. That's just how much stuff there was on that hillside and how tiny differences in our position, work out to a clear shot or a not clear shot. But I wasn't in a hurry, though. It's still just the afternoon of the second day. I wanted to do this right. I didn't want to get in a hurry, take a marginal shot, screw it up, and, wound that elk and spend a couple days tracking him, or even worse, lose him. So, I resolved I'm only going to take a good shot here. And so he very gradually, over the course of maybe 20, 30 minutes, fed across this entire hillside, disappeared into some thicker timber off to my left. And that was disappointing. And I was afraid that was probably it, because it was starting to get late and all of those elk were heading right to left. And I wasn't seeing a good spot where if he continued on the track he was moving, that I would get another shot at him. There was elk still kind of spread out all over that hill. There was cows and young bulls in front of him and behind him, but he looked like he was gone for the evening. And like I said, starting to get dark. I still had enough shooting light, but there was no indication he was going to reappear. Now, at this point, though, this was a nice bull, and Brian decided he was going to try and pull out all the stops and get me a shot at him. I'd seen several nice bulls that I would have been happy with shooting at to this point, but this one was bigger than all of those. So Brian decided to start calling to see if we could coax that bull back out. Because like I said, he had been doing a lot of calling previously in the hunt, and he had gotten elk to talk back to him and whatnot. And it didn't sound like we were like full-blown September rut calling noise in the woods at this point, but there was a lot more talking back and forth than I was anticipating for a late October hunt like this. So he figured we didn't have anything else to lose. He decided he was going to start calling. So he, crawled behind a bush, so he was out of view, and he just started going to town. And Forrest and I and Carson and Finney were all still kind of out in this open spot. And the idea was Brian was going to call. Carson and Finney were going to peel apart that opposite slope with their binoculars and try and spot that bull if he came back out. I was going to shoot him if I could get a clear shot, and then Forrest was going to film the thing. So Brian lets out a bugle. Then a few seconds later, that bull bugles back at us, and he was right where we thought he was. That bugle was coming off to our left from that real thick timber. Brian bugles again. Then the bull bugled. Then Brian cut him off and started bugling on top of that bull, and that royally pissed that bull off. And I'm not an experienced elk hunter. I haven't spent nearly as much time, in the woods pursuing them as some people have, especially like when they rut. But even I could tell that this bull was getting really irritated. And by the way, each time he'd bugle, you could tell that elk was moving closer and closer to us, heading the direction we wanted him to go. Then Brian whips out this cow decoy, and he started cow calling from time to time to further entice that bull to come over to us. So he'd bugle sometimes, he'd cow call, and all of this stuff. Now, it took several minutes of calling back and forth, but that bull eventually came right to the edge of the thick stuff where we could see him again. But once again, he stopped where I couldn't shoot him. He was strongly quartering to me, nearly straight on, and there was 2 really big branches over his vitals. There was no way I could have threaded the needle between them to shoot him where he was standing. So he stood there for about 2 to 3 minutes, trying to see if he could spot that other bull that was talking to him on the other hillside, but he wasn't giving any indication that he was going to move any farther towards us. Brian bugled at him again. He bugled back, and then he turned as if to leave, and he turned to his right and was facing towards my left. Brian could see what was going on, though, and he went crazy and just threw the kitchen sink at him with all of his calls. He was bugling, he was chuckling, he was cow calling, all of that stuff, and that made the bull stop. He paused there for a few seconds, and then he started chuckling. I finally had a clear shot. I had been trying to get a shot on this bull for about an hour now, and finally I got a clear shot on him. Like I said, I was already on the rifle, round in the chamber, safety was off, scope was dialed to the appropriate range. I was ready to go, and I was on him, ready to shoot when he was behind those branches, and I tracked with him as he turned away from me and exposed his vitals. He had barely stopped, was slightly quartering away from me. I put the red dot on my scope just behind his shoulder, squeezed the trigger. I actually shot him while he was chuckling. I hit him just behind the left shoulder, and as I came down out of recoil and started working the bolt, I could see a giant red spot on him through the scope. Forrest did a great job, got the whole thing on video, and on that video, you can see blood immediately start pouring out of that wound like someone turned on a hose. He stood there for about 1 or 2 seconds as I reloaded, and he just absorbed that shot. Then he turned to leave. So he continued to turn to his right and turned around almost 180 degrees and tried to head up the slope and to the right, kind of where he had come from originally, back towards his bed. He took a few steps, then he stopped, reared backwards, and fell back down the hill to practically where he was standing when I shot him. And that was that. I verified on the video he was on his feet for about 10 seconds after that shot. So very fast kill. I was darn impressed with how all that worked out. Now, it turned out I did make a good shot. I'll tell you about that here in a second when we get up to him. Now, Carson and Finney were on him the whole time with their binoculars. They're like, yep, he is down. He's not moving anymore. We're good. They watched him for a few seconds. Okay. Then we all start celebrating, high-fiving, all of that stuff. And then it's time to get over there and find him. Now, before we headed over there, I marked the spot where he went down with my Leupold RX 5000 rangefinder. Now, I talked about this rangefinder in the past. I've had it for a little over a year. In particular, I used it episode 337 on that moose hunt. When I shot that moose, she fell down into some very thick willows. Long story short, this rangefinder, you can sync it with your phone on Onyx, and it will mark a spot on Onyx and drop a waypoint there for the location you just lased. So it'll give you, from Onyx, you can have the location where you are. It'll get you a compass azimuth to the direction you lased, and of course the distance. And then you have those three things, and boom, you can determine, or rather, it can determine the location of the spot you lased. So I lased where we could see that bull elk, dropped a waypoint to him because we had to go all the way down to the bottom of this canyon and then go up the other side, and it was starting to get dark. Now, I will say that he went down in a relatively open spot, at least, on that side of the mountain, and certainly much more open than where that moose went down the previous year in the willows. So it was not especially difficult to find him. But the fact that we had that waypoint to where he was definitely gave me some confidence as we went over there. And it turned out that waypoint dropped almost right on top of where that elk was. And I was pretty darn happy with how that rangefinder performed again. So we packed up, we walked down our side of the canyon, crossed the creek at the bottom, then we started walking up the other side to where he was. And we got to him no problem, still had a little bit of light when we got there, just enough left to take pictures. Now, it looks like on the video that I hit this elk real low in the body, but when we got up to where the elk was, and I could see the bullet hole in his side, the impact on the actual elk was higher on his body than it looked in the video. It turned out I hit him perfectly in the chest. That bullet hit both lungs and the top of the heart. Blood everywhere on the ground, all around him. And when we opened him up later, just inflicted just horrific damage to his vitals. Very, very impressed with the terminal performance of this bullet. But it was amazing to put my hands on this elk. It was a very fun hunt. Lots of ups and downs, especially with my darn eyes. But I ended up getting a great 5x6 bull. It was very cool, very happy with that, but the circumstances and ending of the hunt were unbelievable. matched. There were some real memories there with all of that calling and anticipation and all of that stuff. Very exciting end to the hunt. That turned out to be just a team effort all around, with Brian calling and Finney and Carson helping spot that elk and everything, and Forrest videoing it, and then me making a good shot to end the whole thing. Now, my eye had continually improved over the course of the day. My right eye was feeling pretty good at this point, and my left eye was less bad. But in the photos of me with the elk, it still looks a little swollen, like I got in a fight with it or something. So, once again, just more excitement and drama and memories and stuff associated with the hunt. Now, it did gradually clear up over the next few days, and is perfectly fine for me now. Now, we butchered that elk on the mountain and then packed him out that evening. And it was great having Finney and Carson with us for that part of the hunt. All the 5 of us together got all of the meat and the head out in one load. We actually took out all the organs and stuff of the bull, too, and carried them out as well. So good-sized bull, but the 5 of us came out heavy, but it was fine. We made it out, no problem. Now, I want to give another shout-out to that Spartan Ascent tripod here. Like I mentioned earlier, we had it set up with the long legs to shoot standing earlier in the hunt. I shortened those legs to shoot sitting. That's how I actually shot that elk 333 yards through all that tangled mess. So I had the rifle set up as soon as I got sat down there, and I felt like I was just rock steady when it came time to pull the trigger on that elk. Then, when it was time to pack that elk out, I unscrewed 2 of the legs on it, attached some adapters that I bought online for it for trekking poles, and we used it for trekking poles on the way out. I used one of them, and Forrest used the other. And he, in particular, had a darn heavy load carrying one of the quarters of that elk, plus all of his camera gear and stuff out. So big shout out to Forrest. He did an excellent job of videoing the hunt, and then he was also a trooper helping carry a very heavy load out. But I am glad that we had those trekking poles. One, it's just nice to have those when you're walking on slopes at night with a heavy load on your back, and the fact that it was so slippery going up and down those slopes, those trekking poles were really nice to have, and they kept us from falling and busting our rear end a couple times too. That was not an especially long pack out, but those were some heavy loads, and like I said, it was steep down our side, and then it was steep, muddy, and slippery going up the other side to get to where the ATV was. And we made it back to camp, about 10 o'clock that night. So it was a late night, but not a super duper late night. So big shout out to Brian, Carson, and Finney for all of their help with that. Because I would have had a really long night trying to get that elk out of there by myself if I were doing a self-guided hunt somewhere. Now, Forrest and I spent the next couple days shooting the rifle and filming the content to make videos, of the actual hunt itself and some other stuff we got going on. Then we all headed home. So great hunt. Let's talk a little bit about the gear that I used on it. So first, that Bergara SEMA CF that I used, excellent rifle, very happy with it. It is quite a bit lighter than my Bergara Sierra that I also like, that I used on my 2024 moose hunt. It is on par with my Christensen Arms Ridgeline FFT rifle. But I'll say the SEMA shoots about as well as the Christensen Arms rifle did. It also did so out of the box. I didn't need to have a real break-in like I did with the Christensen. And the Bergara SEMA is also quite a bit less expensive, too. I was also pleasantly surprised at how well the Remington ammo performed. I had low expectations when I bought it, but I was happy with the accuracy of it. Terminal performance was also devastating, too. I have posted details on Patreon where you can see what the heart and lungs and stuff of that elk look like. I can't post that on YouTube or share it on Instagram or any of that stuff. So my supporters on Patreon will be able to check that out. Link is in the episode description if you would like to support me there. See that, plus get access to some of the other content I have published there. So darned impressive terminal performance, especially at 333 yards like that, where the bullet head slowed down quite a bit. And yes, it did exit that elk. I was looking real hard and hoping I would be able to recover it, but it did not. There was entrance and exit wounds on that elk. Now, I used a Leupold VX5 HD 3-15 by 44 millimeter scope. That is my favorite all-around hunting scope. I mounted that scope on this rifle back in July before I went to Africa. I took it to Africa and back. I hunted with it there. Then I used it on this hunt. I've had that scope for several years too, and I have banged it around a lot. That scope is covered in scratches and whatnot, but it's still hanging tough and working well. It was the perfect choice for this hunt. Not too heavy, not too big, There were a couple of guys in camp that had gigantic optics on their rifles, right? Mounting a Hubble telescope, so to speak, on your gun is fine at the range if you're trying to shoot at really long distances like that, but it's a pain to carry around on a hunt. And it can also make it awkward to manipulate the bolt under field conditions if it is too big as well. But the VX5 was wonderful under these circumstances, though. That CDS dial was awesome, too. I did not have the matched elevation turret because I'm always moving that scope, back and forth between different rifles, trying different ammo with it, all that stuff. But I did have, like I said, the memorized come-ups for various ranges, and I was just able to easily dial for each shot. For this shot, I think I dialed like 3.25 MOA. That's what comes to mind anyway right now as I'm thinking about it. I also love that illuminated reticle, especially in lower light conditions, early in the morning or in the evening, like I dealt with on this hunt. You just turn it on, dial for the right range, put that dot where you want to hit, and squeeze the trigger. I've killed a lot of animals with that scope now, and it has always worked like a charm for me. And actually, speaking of which, I used that exact scope on my Christensen in 2023 when I shot that blue wildebeest right at last light. I could not see my crosshairs on that hunt. It was so dark. But I put that red dot right on his neck, squeezed the trigger, and he dropped right where he was standing. But all in all, that Leupold VX5 with the illuminated reticle like that is a fast solution for a tight shot like that under low light conditions where I'm shooting through a lot of cover. Result was a perfect shot and a dead elk. I could not ask for anything more out of a scope. Now, once again, that ultimate firearm sling I'm always talking about worked great. I did quite a bit of walking on this hunt, and once again, it performed well. It was also really good to have when navigating that nasty terrain on my pack out when I wanted both hands free. I had one of them on my trekking pole, then I was using the other one to grab onto trees and limbs and whatnot as I was going down and then up that slippery slope. Now, I've put links to where you can either learn more about or purchase those things in the episode description. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if it's still going to be the case when this episode comes out, but it is as I'm recording this. There is a fantastic sale going on for the Leupold VX5 scope, the exact one that I used on this hunt, where you can get it for several $100s off full retail price. So I will put a link to where you can get it, and hopefully that deal will still be available when you listen to this. Now, check me out on Instagram to see a picture of this elk. Follow me at @thebiggamehunter_ if you're not already doing that. You can see it there. And like I mentioned, there is a full YouTube video about this entire hunt that I made with the footage provided by Forrest. He did a great job with the footage. I got it all put together. Link is in the episode description. Check it out to watch the entire thing. Okay, now let's talk about those two announcements I referenced earlier to include that upcoming podcast hunt. First, I am pleased to announce that I am now booking hunts for a new outfitter in the USA. Over the last couple of years, I've received lots of requests from listeners for recommendations for an outfitter to book with to hunt elk, antelope, and mule deer. Well, now I have an option for you guys, and I actually used this trip as a way to verify how good this particular outfitter was before I put my name on the line with them. This was an awesome, awesome hunt. I had a lot of fun. They passed with flying colors. Now, this outfitter that I hunted with and that I'm now selling hunts for is not the cheapest outfitter out there. They also don't give you the best potential for giant bulls. But I will tell you, they offer an outstanding opportunity to hunt elk. It's not hard to get a tag with them. They're actually 100% on all of their clients getting tags for the last 3 years. They also have high success rates on nice elk, antelope, and mule deer. Now, I'll talk more about that stuff here in a second. Now, like I mentioned, they primarily hunt on private land. They have over 200,000 acres either owned or leased. Plus, like I said, there's also a little bit of public land here and there. But the bottom line is you're going to be hunting on land that they have exclusive access on, and you're not going to be dealing with, bumping into other hunters or any of that stuff out there. They also have good road access with ATVs and trucks across all of that land. They can accommodate hunters of various physical fitness and experience levels, too. Now, there was one guy in camp that looked like he was quite a bit younger than me. He looked like he was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. I'm 40. There were a couple of other hunters there in their 40s and 50s. We all did quite a bit of walking, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't handle. And none of these guys were, ultra endurance athletes or any of that stuff, too. Just regular guys. Now, there were also several guys there in their 60s, 70s, stuff like that, that just couldn't walk as far. So the guides kind of tailored the hunt to the abilities of the hunter that they were paired with, both their shooting abilities and their physical fitness and all of that other stuff too. If you go there and you say, hey, listen, I feel good shooting out to 400 yards, they're not going to put you in a situation where you're likely to get a shot at an elk at 900 yards, for instance. Everybody in camp got a reasonable shot at an elk. Everybody had a lot of fun, too. Accommodations were comfortable. We stayed in a lodge. You could take a shower there, sleep in a bed, all of that stuff. It was, heated and everything, too. Food was good. There were also plenty of snacks and beverages between meals. All of the guides were skilled and friendly, too. I was especially impressed with Brian, but he was not the only great guide there. And like I mentioned earlier, I also really liked that all of the guides were happy to help and pitch in and help each other out and stuff like that. That applies on the big stuff, like, how I had the extra guys come out of my hunt. They didn't do that just for me. They did it to everybody as appropriate. And it also worked out on the little stuff too. There were a couple of instances where I was, sitting there having a cup of coffee, just watching what was going on. And I'd see, there was dirt on the floor and one of the guides would just go and sweep it up and clean it up without anybody asking him to. Now, like I mentioned earlier, too, this outfitter also has something of a turnkey operation with the draw. They have a system that allows hunters to get a tag with little or no points. So don't feel like you need to have just an absolute pile of points to hunt here. This isn't an especially difficult draw like Arizona is. And while they're not budget elk hunts with this outfitter, they also are quite a bit less expensive than hunting on an Indian reservation somewhere or buying a landowner tag in a state like New Mexico, for instance. Furthermore, it's not often that you will get to hunt elk with a rifle where you also have the potential for calling like I did on my hunt. There was lots of bugling and whatnot over the course of this hunt, a lot more than I expected hunting late in October like I did. Now, I probably saw around 100 elk, all told, during the entirety of my trip. I saw a couple of shooter bulls, and I killed a 5x6 I was super happy with on day 2. And by the way, there were 3 full days remaining in my hunt at that point. Now, this outfitter runs 3 rifle elk hunts each year, a first, second, and third hunt, back to back to back in October like this. On their first rifle hunt, they were 13 for 13 on shot opportunities. 2 guys wounded and lost elk. Everyone else killed and recovered their elk. Now, on that hunt, you might catch the end of the rut. The benefit to hunting then is the elk are a little bit less pressured then. Guys are primarily hunting resident elk on that first elk hunt, but the benefit of that is there are a lot of resident elk there. Now, I was on the second rifle elk hunt. There were 15 of us in camp. All 15 guys got a shot at an elk. 1 guy did not kill, he shot at and missed an elk. Now, the benefit to the second rifle elk season is that you might run into a so-called second rut where cows that were not bred the first time around come back into heat. And like I said, I think that was what was going on with all of that bugling and stuff that was still occurring when I was there. Also, on the second hunt, you are more likely to get some cold weather or a storm or something that pushes some elk down from the high country into the area where we hunt. Now, the third rifle season is still ongoing as I record this, so I don't know how it turned out. That hunt always takes place the last week of October. As you get later into the year like that, the odds increase that there's a winter storm that pushes elk down in that season, and that can really kick things into high gear when that happens. But long story short, success rates are pretty high across the board on all 3 of those hunts. They all have different pros and cons, but I wouldn't say there's a bad one to hunt. So if you want to hit the easy button and just have a good time hunting elk, this is the place to go. Now, as far as size on the elk go, like I mentioned, there was that guy that had to leave early that shot the spike. There was one guy that shot a 4x4, but he was a very new elk hunter, and he was very happy with the shot that he got on that elk. Most of the rest of the guys shot an elk more or less the same size that I did. And there were, I think, 3 guys that shot elk in the 6-point range that were not substantially bigger than mine, but noticeably bigger than mine. So that's a reasonable expectation for the sort of bulls people are taking on these hunts. And yes, they do kill elk that are bigger than that on occasion, but I don't want to say, hey, you go there and you got a real good chance of shooting a 340-inch bull, something like that. They've done it before, but it's not a regular occurrence. Now, I had a wonderful time there. I am looking forward to going back, and I actually know for a fact that 4 of the guys I was in camp with booked to return. Now, in addition to elk, they also have excellent hunting for mule deer there. That place, I think mule deer are kind of the crown jewel of the animals that they have in terms of the trophy quality. So if you want a big mule deer, this is a place you need to check out. And they do both archery and rifle hunts for both deer and elk. They also offer cow elk hunts in the wintertime, November through January 31st. Those hunts are less expensive than bull hunts, essentially 100% success rates on these. They just get piles and piles of cow elk there in the wintertime, especially late when they get a lot of snow on the ground. That is a nice way to get some meat in the freezer and just have a good time hunting a cow elk if that's something you are interested in. Okay, so what is the name of this outfitter? It's the R&K Hunting Company in Wyoming. I think they run a first-class operation. I have put a link to their website in the episode description. I've also put the phone number for Rob Massa there as well. He is the manager of R&K there in Wyoming. He's an experienced hunter, super nice guy, and he is happy to answer all of your questions. Now, he is a busy man, but he is also good about getting back to people with inquiries. So leave a message. If he doesn't answer, he will get back to you. Tell him I sent you when you contact him, and if you end up booking with them, let me know. I'd love to hear how your hunt goes when you're back. And if you have additional questions about what things were like there, send me an email, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. I'm happy to answer all of your questions, tell you all about the nitty-gritty details of stuff. In addition to deer and elk, R&K also conduct antelope hunts in August, September, and October. Season varies a little bit depending on which unit you're booked for. Speaking of which, I am pleased to announce I will be hosting a big game hunting podcast, Pronghorn Hunt, in Wyoming with R&K, 9 to 14 October 2026. This is a fully guided and outfitted hunt on giant tracts of private land in southwest Wyoming. We're not in exactly the same spot where I hunted elk because the best pronghorn country isn't necessarily the best elk country. We'll be hunting in more of the lowlands, but we're going to be hunting not far from where I was elk hunting. And we will stay in the same lodge that I was hunting in, and we'll have some of the same guides that were on this elk hunt on this antelope hunt. All right, there will be a total of 6 of us, 6 listeners plus me in the lodge together. There will be a couple of other hunters there that aren't in our group, but don't worry, everyone will hunt one-on-one with their own guide. You'll also have your own room in the lodge. And like I said, they hunt on so much land, there's plenty of space for everyone to spread out and have a great hunt without stepping on each other. Plan on arriving 9 October. We'll hunt 10 through 13 October and then depart on 14 October. Now, it might not be the case anymore when you listen to this episode, but as I record this, there are 2 spots remaining for this hunt. I opened it up to my Patreon supporters before I offered it to anyone else, and a bunch of guys have already jumped on it. But like I said, 2 spots remaining right now as I record this. Email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, if you are interested in joining me on this hunt next year. I'd love to meet you in person. I would love to hunt with you. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.